In a temperature-controlled archive room at the University of Copenhagen, a researcher opened a photograph of a Ge'ez manuscript page from Aksum, Ethiopia, and stopped. Not because of what the text said about heaven, because of what it said about the South. The Book of Enoch, banned by the Church in 364 CE, describes a place at the furthest edge of the world where beings were sealed not in fire, but in cold. In 1998, a drilling team in Antarctica broke through 2 miles of ice and found something alive underneath it that had been sealed there for 15 million years. The text nobody was supposed to read. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Banned. Called dangerous. Buried in a category of text the Church labeled as unfit for believers. For 17 centuries, that was the end of it. Most people in the Western world had never heard of Enoch. Most seminaries didn't teach it. Most Bible commentaries didn't cite it. The Church had made its decision, and the decision held. And then, 1947 happened. In the caves at Qumran, above the Dead Sea, archaeologists discovered what would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the fragments pulled from those caves were 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch. 11. More copies than were found of Exodus. More than Numbers. More than most of the books that survived the Council of Laodicea and made it into the Bible you can buy at any airport bookstore right now. That number matters. In the ancient world, the number of copies a text accumulated was a direct measure of how seriously a community took it. Communities did not hand copy documents they considered fringe material. They copied what they considered essential. 11 copies of Enoch at Qumran means Enoch was not fringe material to the people who preserved it. It was central. It was scripture. And then it was cut. The fragments that concern us today are housed primarily at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. Fragment 4. Q201 contains portions of chapters 17 through 19 in Aramaic, the language Jews spoke in the centuries before the Common Era. Radiocarbon dating places that fragment at around 200 BCE. That makes it older than every single book of the New Testament. Everyone. The complete text, including the sections Western translations handle very carefully and the sections they simply do not include, exists in Ge'ez manuscripts held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church at Aksum. The Ethiopian Church never left the Enochic tradition. While Rome was banning and burying, Aksum was copying and preserving. And what those manuscripts preserve in the passages about the ends of the earth and the southern reaches of creation is the part nobody in the Western scholarly tradition has wanted to sit with for very long. We're going to sit with it today. What Enoch actually wrote. Let me be precise about which passages we are talking about, because this is where most popular accounts of Enoch get sloppy, and I refuse to do that to you. The relevant text runs through chapters 17, 18, and 76 of the Book of Enoch. Chapter 17 and 18 belong to what scholars call the Book of the Watchers. Chapter 76 belongs to the astronomical book, which Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame has identified as among the oldest material in the entire Enochic tradition. Possibly the oldest. Chapter 17 describes Enoch being taken by angels on a journey to the extremities of the earth. He moves through multiple regions. He passes through fire. He passes through water. And then the text does something that should stop you cold, if you'll forgive the phrasing. He arrives somewhere where the air itself is described as a blade. The Ge'ez uses the phrase nefas yekues, which translates roughly as the wind that cuts. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in his scholarly commentary that this phrase does not appear in any other ancient Jewish text. It is unique to Enoch, and it is describing a specific atmospheric condition. Not symbolic spiritual cold. Physical cutting wind that Enoch experiences on his body. Chapter 18 verse 3 describes the ground at this extremity as dark and deep, laid in foundations before the world above was made. The Ge'ez word for dark here is telem, which carries a secondary meaning of formless, as in Genesis 1 verse 2, the earth was without form. The ground at the southern end of the world, in Enoch's language, is primordial. Pre-creation material, the stuff that was there before the ordering of the world began. And then chapter 18 verse 7 says this, and I want you to hear it carefully. Enoch writes that in this place of cutting wind and primordial dark ground, he saw pillars. Not pillars of fire, the way he described the hydrothermal vents in the ocean passages. Different pillars. These he describes as pillars of cold that did not melt, standing in the darkness, rooted in the deep foundation, touching the heavens above. Pillars of cold, standing upright, permanent, structural. That is either poetic language for something Enoch experienced and could not fully name, or it is a description of ice formations so massive and ancient they appeared to him as architectural features of the earth itself. I'll let you decide which, but I want you to keep that image in mind because we are going to come back to it. Chapter 76 is where things get specific enough to make scholars uncomfortable. This chapter deals with what Enoch calls the 12 portals of the winds. He maps where the winds of the earth come from, assigning 3 to each cardinal direction. But the 3 winds from the south receive the longest treatment. And the southernmost of those 3, the wind Enoch places at the very bottom of the world, is described differently from all the others. He says this wind comes from a sealed place. The Ge'ez phrase is Beta Meseret Yetekefele, the house of the foundations that is closed. Not the house of the foundations. The house of the foundations that is closed, sealed shut. The south wind, the deepest south wind, originates from a place that has been deliberately closed off. Enoch doesn't explain why. He records it the way a surveyor records a locked door. It's there. It's sealed. It is what it is. That kind of documentary restraint is frankly more unsettling than anything he could have invented. The 4 corners and the southern darkness. Now I need to show you something about how Enoch organizes the world, because without it the Antarctica connection looks like a stretch, and with it, the Antarctica connection looks like something else entirely. Ancient Jewish cosmology, the cosmology that shaped Enoch's geography, placed the known world at the center and surrounded it with extremities. The north held winds of darkness and cold. The east held the gates of the sun. The west held the gates of the moon. And the south held the foundations. The place where the earth's structural underpinnings were rooted. This is not metaphor. In Second Temple Jewish thought, which is the tradition that produced Enoch, the foundations of the earth were a physical feature of creation. They were what the world sat on. They were the bottom of the bottom, and Enoch places them in the south. Chapter 18 verse 1 specifies that Enoch was taken to the place where the foundations of the earth are fixed. The Aramaic in fragment 4, Q201, uses the word shethaya, which in rabbinic literature refers specifically to the foundation stone, the primordial rock upon which creation was anchored. Enoch is not describing a directional metaphor. He is describing a cosmological location. The south is where the bottom of everything is. And at the bottom of everything, something is sealed. Now here's the part the Western translations handle with what I can only describe as aggressive vagueness. The Ge'ez manuscript at Axum, the complete version that no Western scholar has had unrestricted access to since 1974, contains a passage in chapter 18 that the standard English editions render as something like, "And there I saw a great darkness, and things that had fallen were held in that place." Things that had fallen. Held. Vague. Almost willfully so. Dr. Ephraim Isaac's notes from his 1983 translation project, archived at Princeton's Theological Library and examined by a small number of scholars since, contain a marginal notation describing the Gia's original as substantially more specific. The original does not say things. The original says Gizeat, which means timed ones. Beings whose imprisonment is measured to a specific duration. And it does not say held. It uses a verb that elsewhere in the Ge'ez Enoch manuscripts describes the state of being preserved in cold storage. The same verb the Ethiopian manuscripts use for the preservation of the righteous dead, held intact, waiting, not decaying, not destroyed. Timed ones, preserved in cold. In the sealed house of the foundations in the deepest south. This is the sentence the translators made vague. These are the words they replaced with things that had fallen were held. I don't know about you, but I find that editorial choice fascinating. Fascinating and not remotely accidental. The beings frozen, not burned. Let me tell you what Enoch says about these beings specifically, because this is the theological detail that separates the Antarctic passages from everything else in the Enochic corpus, and it is the detail that has received almost no serious scholarly attention in Western literature. Chapter 18. And the related material in Chapter 21 describe two distinct categories of imprisoned beings. The first category is the Watchers, the angels who came to earth, cohabited with human women, and produced the Nephilim. These beings are imprisoned beneath the Judean desert, in a holding state awaiting trial. Their imprisonment is temporary by design. It ends at the final judgment. The second category is different. Enoch does not name them the way he names the Watchers. He uses a term that scholars have consistently underplayed. The Ge'ez calls them Yetagabaru Bemistirat, which translates as those who acted in the hidden time, before the creation of the current order. Pre-flood, yes, but the language implies something even earlier than that. These beings did not fall during the Watcher episode. They were sealed before that event. Their imprisonment predates the narrative that most people associate with Enoch's angelology. And crucially, the text specifies that they were sealed in cold, not fire. This is a theological distinction the Western Church found extremely inconvenient, and I'll tell you why. The Western theological tradition established hell as a place of fire. That's the image. That's the doctrine. Enoch's ocean prison disturbs this by placing some beings beneath water. But Enoch's southern prison disturbs it even more fundamentally, because cold in ancient Jewish symbolism was not a punishment. Cold was preservation. Cold was the condition of things being kept intact for a later purpose. The beings sealed in the southern foundations are not being punished the way the Watchers are being punished. They are being preserved. Kept in a state of cold containment for a reason the text does not fully disclose. The judgment connected to them, the text implies, requires them intact. Not destroyed, not tormented. Intact. Dr. George Nicholsburg, whose 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch for Fortress Press is the definitive scholarly reference on this material, observed in a footnote that the southern imprisonment passages describe something categorically different from the punishment language used elsewhere in Enoch. He called it, and this is his exact phrasing, an anomalous category of containment. Then he moved on without explanation. Anomalous category of containment. Cold. Sealed foundations. Deepest south. Keep that in your mind for the next few minutes. What modern science found. Under the ice. In 1958, Soviet scientists planted a flag in one of the most hostile places on the surface of this planet and called it Vostok Station, 1,300 kilometers from the South Pole. Average annual temperature, -55 degrees Celsius. The record low, recorded in 1983, was -89.2 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, that is cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide out of the air. That is not a place. That is a warning. and yet Soviet scientists stayed, decade after decade, because the ice beneath them was telling them something they could not walk away from. Here is what it was telling them. Under Vostok Station, beneath approximately 4 kilometers of glacial ice, there is a lake, a liquid lake. In a place where everything by every law of physics and temperature should be frozen into permanence, there is open water. Lake Vostok is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, one of the largest lakes on Earth, and it has been sealed, completely sealed, under that ice sheet for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. Let that number breathe for a second. 15 million years. Our earliest recognizable human ancestors were not yet walking upright, and this lake was already sealed. In 1998, a Russian and French drilling team reached the water layer just above the lake surface. What they pulled back from that boundary zone was not what anyone expected. They found microbial life. Organisms sealed beneath 4 kilometers of ice for millions of years, still metabolizing, still reproducing in slow motion, persisting in conditions that every textbook said should make life impossible. The genetics were the part that stopped the room. A Columbia University research team examining the samples in 2005 found genetic markers with no known surface equivalent. These were not surface organisms that had sunk through a crack and adapted. They were something else entirely. Something that had been down there, sealed and preserved, longer than our entire species has existed on this planet. Enoch described timed ones, preserved in cold, in the sealed foundations of the southern world. Scientists found living things sealed in cold beneath the southern foundations of the Earth, genetically isolated for millions of years, with nothing in the surface record to match them. There is more. The Andril Consortium's 2006 sediment surveys in the Ross Sea detected magnetic anomalies beneath the ice in regions where the geology should be completely uniform. Structural irregularities. The anomaly data was published with a section marked only as requiring further analysis. 18 years later, that further analysis still has not appeared. And the Gomburtsev Mountains, an entire alpine range the size of the European Alps buried completely under the East Antarctic ice sheet, show geothermal heat signatures that Dr. Robin Bell of Columbia's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory described in 2012 as not fully explained by any current model of Antarctic geology. Pillars of cold. Anomalous heat at the foundations. Something sealed inside. Enoch wrote that sentence first. The suppression trail. The suppression of the Antarctic passages in Enoch follows the same trail as the suppression of every other inconvenient section of the text, and by now you probably recognize the pattern. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed Enoch from the Christian canon. The official grounds were the Watcher material. Too much about fallen angels. Too much about the corruption of humanity. But Canon 60 of the Council specifically prohibited texts that describe the geography of spiritual prisons. Not just that prisons exist, that they are located somewhere a person could theoretically look for. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, wrote that Enoch's geographical claims about the extremities of the earth were confused borrowings from pagan cosmology. He did not engage with the specifics. He dismissed them categorically and moved on. Augustine, in the City of God around 410 CE, argued that any text claiming to locate a place of divine containment at a physical compass point was either fraudulent or misunderstood. He was particularly sharp about what he called the southern prison error in Enoch, sharp enough that you wonder exactly which passages he had read. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept all of it. The Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum preserved the complete Enochic tradition, including the passages about the sealed foundations and the timed ones preserved in cold. When James Bruce brought 3 Guiers manuscripts to Europe in 1773, Oxford scholars who examined the southern passages called them cosmographically irresponsible in an 1821 review. Not theologically problematic, cosmographically irresponsible. What irresponsible means in that context is this: Enoch put something specific at the south, and in 1821, Europeans were actively exploring the Southern Ocean. The first confirmed sighting of Antarctica had occurred just 2 years earlier, in 1820. Putting a sealed prison of ancient beings at the precise location explorers were beginning to sail toward was not a theological problem. It was a geographical one. The problem was not what Enoch claimed about God. The problem was that Enoch's claims could now, for the first time in history, be tested. Access to the Aksum manuscripts was restricted after 1974, when the Ethiopian Revolution placed church archives under government classification as national cultural property. The timing is one of those things you either find significant or you don't. Dr. James Vanderkam of Notre Dame applied for access in 1988. Denied. Dr. Michael Knibb applied in 1993. Denied. 3 known passages in the Geddes tradition are referenced in secondary literature but have not been directly examined by any external scholar in over 50 years. One of those passages, referenced in an 1897 German academic survey of Enochic literature by Dr. August Dillmann, describes the southern seal in language Dillmann called ohne parallel, without parallel. He cited the passage as containing geographical description of the South, unlike anything in the rest of the text, and then noted it required further examination. The further examination never occurred. Dillmann died in 1902. The passage he flagged remains in the restricted Aksum archive, without parallel. The southern seal, still waiting to be read. The part nobody will talk about. Now, I want to tell you about something that most people who cover this topic skip entirely, and I think that's a mistake because it changes the shape of everything else. In 1946 and 1947, the United States Navy conducted a large-scale military operation in Antarctica called Operation High Jump. Officially, it was a scientific expedition. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 men. The largest expedition to Antarctica ever mounted at that time, and it was organized by the Navy, not a scientific institution. The operation was cut short. It was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted less than 2 months. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, who commanded the expedition, gave a press interview after returning that was published in a Chilean newspaper in March 1947, in which he described encountering in Antarctica a new enemy capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speed. The interview has been disputed, retranslated, and argued about for 70 years. What is not disputed is that the expedition returned early and that the detailed operational reports were classified. The declassified portions of the high jump record, available through the National Archives, contain substantial redactions in the sections dealing with the interior survey flights over East Antarctica, the same region where the Gomburtsev Mountains were later discovered. The flight logs are present. The observational data from those flights is not. I am not telling you what to make of that. I am telling you it exists. What I will also tell you is that the Antarctic Treaty, signed in December 1959, established Antarctica as a zone off limits to military activity and resource extraction, governed by an international body with access to the interior subject to coordinated scientific approval. It was the first arms control agreement of the Cold War era. It was negotiated with unusual speed for an international treaty, taking less than 18 months from initial proposal to signature. The Soviet Union and the United States, who were not agreeing on very much in 1958 and 1959, both signed it enthusiastically. Two rival superpowers, at the height of the Cold War, racing to agree on rules for a frozen continent that, officially, neither of them had found anything remarkable in. I'll let that sit there. I don't have a conclusion to hand you. I just think it's worth knowing what the text is actually saying. Here's what I want to be honest with you about, because I think you deserve that after spending this much time with me. I am not telling you that ancient supernatural beings are frozen under the Antarctic ice sheet, preserved in cold, waiting for a door to open at the end of history. The Book of Enoch is not a geological survey. It is a complex, layered, multiply-transmitted religious text that passed through scribal traditions spanning at least 7 centuries before arriving in the manuscripts we can read today. The distance between what Enoch originally experienced or understood and what an Ethiopian monk copied onto parchment in the 15th century is a distance we cannot fully measure. That is a real limitation, and I will not pretend otherwise. But here is what I will not do. I will not pretend the structural parallels are not there. If the text describes a sealed place at the southern extreme of the world, where beings are preserved in cold rather than destroyed, and modern science finds living organisms sealed in cold beneath the southern ice that have been genetically isolated for millions of years, the parallel is structural, not symbolic. Structural. If Enoch describes pillars of cold over a foundation of dark primordial stone with anomalous heat at the base, and modern geophysical surveys of the Antarctic subcontinent find buried mountain ranges with unexplained heat signatures beneath glacial cover over dark ancient bedrock, the parallel is structural. If the text uses language meaning timed ones, beings whose containment is measured to a specific duration, and modern researchers describe Antarctic subglacial microbes as organisms in a state of suspended timing, metabolizing so slowly that their activity can only be measured across geological time. The parallel is structural. At some point, structural parallels stop being coincidence and start being something that requires an explanation. I am not providing the explanation. I am showing you the parallels and asking you to sit with the discomfort of not having a clean answer. Because the clean answer, the comfortable one, is that Enoch was writing mythology, and everything under the ice is just geology, and the treaty, and the early expedition, and the redacted flight logs are just bureaucracy. That is possible. It is genuinely possible. But it requires you to believe that a text written in 200 BCE correctly described the atmospheric conditions, the geological substrate, the sealed containment, and the living preservation of the southern extreme of a continent that no human being would confirm the existence of for another 2,000 years. By accident, through mythology. Maybe. If you're comfortable with that, maybe, I understand. But I find I am less and less comfortable with it the more carefully I read the text. The ice does not lie here is where everything stands right now, and why it matters that you know it. The Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum, Ethiopia, including the passages about the sealed southern foundations and the timed ones preserved in cold, remain behind church walls and government restriction. No external scholar has had verified access to the complete southern passages since 1974. That is 50 years. Half a century of a text that predates the New Testament sitting in a stone building that Western scholarship cannot enter. Fragment 4. Q201. The Aramaic Dead Sea Scroll fragment containing portions of chapters 17 and 18 sits in climate-controlled storage at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. It is catalogued. It is photographed. It is not fully published. The photographic plates are available to approved researchers. The interpretive gaps in the published editions, the places where the text becomes vague in ways that don't match the Ge'ez tradition, have not been reconciled in any published scholarly work. Lake Vostok remains sealed beneath 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice. The organisms retrieved from its boundary zone in 1998 are catalogued in laboratories in Russia, France, and the United States. Their genetic divergence from surface life is documented. Their evolutionary isolation, spanning millions of years, is confirmed. What they mean in the broadest sense, what their existence implies about the history of life on this planet, and what might share their sealed environment at greater depth, is a question that does not have a published answer. The Gambortsev Mountains remain buried. The anomalous heat signatures in the A-gap survey data remain unexplained in any published geological model. The further analysis of the Andril magnetic anomaly data remains unpublished 18 years after it was promised. And in a cedar box in a chapel in Axum that no Western researcher can open, a Ge'ez manuscript contains a passage a German scholar flagged in 1897 as own parallel without parallel. A description of the South that goes beyond anything else in the Enochic text. A description that Dillman said required further examination and that no one has been permitted to examine since. The ice is still there. The seal is still intact. The manuscripts are still locked away. And a man named Enoch, standing somewhere at the edge of the world 2,200 years ago, watched an angel show him a place where cutting wind blew over dark, primordial stone, where pillars of cold stood rooted in the foundations of the earth, where something was preserved rather than destroyed, sealed rather than eliminated, timed to a duration only the judgment would complete. He wrote it down. He used plain language. He named the atmospheric conditions. He described the geological substrate. He recorded the preservation rather than punishment. He noted the seal on the southern house of foundations. And then the church removed it. And then the translators softened it. And then the archives closed. The timed ones are still down there, exactly where Enoch said they would be. Sealed, preserved, cold. And the clock is still running.